few days ago, we looked at a story about George Washington, and we wrote the different things we found in the biography. We call these text features. Not all biographies have them, but some do and some don't. But they're things that you often see in biographies. We said there was a table of contents that told me what page everything was on. There are headings at the top of parts of the book that tell me what that part's about. There's captions underneath the story, the pictures or the maps to tell me what they're about. There's lots and lots of dates. All biographies have dates. There's usually real photos. Sometimes there will be a map, like there was in George Washington. And sometimes there will be a timeline that tells me the order of things that happened in their life. Now, in our Joseph Bruchac story, was there a table of contents? No. Was there headings? I don't think there was. Captions? Yes. Every picture had a caption underneath it. Did it have lots of dates? Yes. Did it have real photos?
Sometimes.
Yes, and there were some that were drawings too. Did it have a map? I don't think it had a map. And it didn't have a timeline. So it didn't have everything here. Remember, not all biographies have to have these things. These are just common features. So today I'm going to read you the book for what I'm going to write my biography about. I'm just going to show you how I'm going to read my book. And when you're doing your biography, you're going to read a book or two about the person. And you guys, I would really like to be able to read 2 or 3 books, or the paper I gave you and another book or 2. And then you're going to just think about what you learned, and you're going to fill in a few questions on a sheet. That's going to get us started on biographies. So I'm going to read Dr. Seuss, the Great Doodler. Remember, next week is Read Across America, Dr. Seuss Week. It is a beautiful day in La Jolla, California. A writer and artist is at work in his studio. The telephone rings. A reporter is calling with big news. The writer has won a big award for his books. It is the Pulitzer Prize. The writer is Ted Giesel, also known as Dr. Seuss. His real name is Ted Giesel. Ted nearly falls off his chair. Is this a joke? Ted loves playing jokes and pranks, but he takes his work seriously. Now the world is doing so too. Not bad for a lifelong doodler. So a doodler, a person who doodles, is a person that just draws all the time on their papers. Several of you like to draw on your papers, so that would be a doodler. You'd be a doodler or doodling. Theodore Ted Seuss Giesel was born on March 2nd, 1904. There's an important date, right? The day he was born. In Springfield, Massachusetts. His mother's name was Henrietta Seuss Giesel. She read to him and his big sister Marnie. She also sang chants she once used to sell pies in her parents' shop. He later said he got his love of wordplay and reading from his mother. Remember how we talked about we get lots of things that we love from our mother or fathers or grandparents? Thanks to his father, Theodore, Ted became interested in machines. His father tinkered in his shop making wacky inventions. One of them was a machine that made arm muscles stronger. So maybe that's where he got his wackiness for his books. From an early age, Ted liked to doodle. He always had a pencil and a pad at hand. Near his house was a zoo, and laying in bed at night, he could hear the lions roaring. That's pretty cool. And the elephants trumpeting. During the day, he would go there and doodle pictures of animals. Marnie said his animals never looked quite like the real ones. Do you see lots of animals in Dr. Seuss's books? Yeah. They're kind of wacky looking. That's where he started that. Ted had a happy childhood until World War I broke out. The Giesels were German-American. Many Americans blamed the war on Germany. Kids bullied Ted. He wanted to prove he was a true American. So he joined the Boy Scouts and sold war bonds. He was one of the top 10 bond sellers. Former President Theodore Roosevelt came to honor the 10 Scouts, but there was a mix-up and no medal for Ted. He was so embarrassed. Ever since that day, he had stage fright. That's something about Dr. Seuss, he didn't like to be on a stage. After high school, Ted went to Dartmouth College. He worked on the humor magazine. He drew zany-looking animals with zany names. Can y'all see some of those pictures? A bligv was a critter with an umbrella tail. Sometimes he signed his drawings with just his middle name, Seuss. So Seuss was his middle name. Ted went on to study at Oxford University in England. He was bored by the long classes. So what did he do when he was bored? He doodled. A fellow American student saw him doodling. "That's a very fine flying cow," said Helen Palmer. "You ought to be an artist." Ted and Helen rode around together on a motorcycle. Ted wanted to marry Helen, but how would he earn a living? So he didn't have a job. Back in Springfield, Ted drew tons of cartoons. He sent them to magazines signed Dr. Theophrastus Seuss. That's a weird name, Theophrastus. A magazine called the Saturday Evening Post bought some of his cartoons. Ted also got a job at a different magazine. Now he could marry Helen. They moved into an apartment in New York City, and he kept on doodling. So he's making pictures, and he's getting paid for them. Ted drew a clever cartoon about a bug spray called Flit. The bug spray company loved it and gave him more work. He became an ad man, and as he did when he was a kid, he made up zany critters, this time for ads. Years later, zany fish like these would fill his book, McElligot's Pool. You also see those fish on Redfish, Bluefish. Yep. And this one kind of looks like the Grinch almost. Ted wanted to do more with his doodling. A trip by ocean liner inspired him. The ship's engine droned, dum-de-dum, dum-de-dum. He started to write the engine of the machine, the rhythm of the engine. He wrote a story about the crazy things a boy sees on his way to and from school. We sent it around town. 27 publishers. A publisher is a person that prints your book for you. Turned them down. They said, "Nope, we don't like your book." 27 companies. Then he ran into a friend who had just become a children's book editor. Mike McClintock loved the book. The title was, now see if you've ever read this one, "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street." That was his very first book. It was Dr. Seuss's very first book. Dr. Seuss went on to publish new children's books at a steady rate for the rest of his life. Some of them won awards. Horton Hatches the Egg was a big hit in 1940. The story was silly, but it had a deep message. People loved the elephant who said, "I meant what I said, and I said what I meant." An elephant's faithful 100%. Ted did not publish a children's book during World War II. Lots of Americans wanted the United States to stay out of war, but Ted wasn't one of them. He drew cartoons that poked fun at Hitler and Japan. They urged America to fight for what was right. So he stopped making books for just a little bit during the war. America finally entered the war. Ted joined the Army because he really wanted to be part of the war. He worked with a team of filmmakers in Hollywood. They made funny training cartoons starring a soldier who couldn't do anything right. Army pals like Chuck Jones and Petey Eastman would work with Ted in years to come. So whenever we read some of Dr. Seuss's books next week, or some books that were written by his company, you'll see some of the books are by Chuck Jones, and some of them are by Petey Eastman. So Are You My Mother? Or that one is by Petey Eastman. So we'll look at the authors. We'll see those names again. After the war, Ted and Helen stayed in California. In 1947, Ted found an old, unused fire tower in La Jolla. He and Helen fell in love with it. They bought the tower and made it their home. Ted's studio was in the tower. How cool would that be, to have your job in a tower? He kept a hat rack there filled with wacky hats. Look at that hat. A fireman's hat from Ecuador, a Turkish fez, and admiral's hats from all around the world. And sometimes when he was having trouble with the story, he would put on a silly hat. Ted wanted each book to be perfect. He wrote and rewrote. He read aloud to Helen. He sketched and resketched. He pinned his stretches to a corkboard. He worked until the words and pictures were just right. Then he took his book to New York City. In his publisher's office, he would read it aloud, and workers would crowd around to listen to Ted's latest story. Oh, this is my favorite part. In 1955, Life magazine ran an article that said most early reading books were boring. They said the books for kids that were just learning to read were really boring. So the job of writing books for early readers should go to artists like Dr. Seuss and Walt Disney. Ted was dared to write a book using only 225 simple words. He thought he could write the book in 2 weeks. It took him more than a year. The Cat in the Hat was published in 1957. The book sold like hotcakes. It changed the way children learned how to read. So what was so important about the cat in the hat? It had lots of simple words, but a lot of them did what? Rhyme. That's right. They rhymed. We'll talk about that more next week too. How the Grinch Stole Christmas also came out in 1957. Someone once said that the cat was Ted on a good day, and the Grinch was Ted on a bad day. Ted felt he was more like the gruff and grumpy character. His car license plate even said Grinch on his car. 8 years later, Ted worked with Chuck Jones to make an animated television special based on How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Both the show and the book became Christmas classics. In 1958, Ted became president of Beginner Books. And when we read a bunch of books next week, I'll show you. Each one has a little seal on it. It says Beginner Books. And that's the name of the company. He would publish a line of easy-to-read books like Cat in the Hat. The office was like a fun house. Ted wrote some of the readers. His wife, Helen, wrote some too. He hired friends to do others. Mike McClintock wrote A Fly Went By. P.D. Eastman wrote Go Dog Go. Ted published Stan and Jan Bernstein's first book about the Bernstein Bears. Y'all all read Bernstein Bears. He didn't write them, but he published them. His company made the books. Everything Ted touched turned into a bestseller. Then in 1967, a terrible thing happened. Helen died. Ted was lonely and lost. A year later, he married Audrey Stone Diamond. She had a good eye. She wanted Ted to use more color in his books, and Ted's work became more colorful. So his new wife helped him get more color in his books. Audrey came to live with Ted in the tower. From there, he saw how much construction was taking place. Trees came down and buildings went down. So you know what story is about things getting cut down? What is it, Emery? The Lorax. So he started doodling about it, and he wrote The Lorax. It is a story of a little creature who speaks for the trees. He tries to save them from the greedy Onceler. The story carried a powerful message about our environment. It's a long book, isn't it? Another book with a powerful message was the Butter Battle book. It tells about the Ukes and the Zooks. Their two armies are fighting over which side of their bread to butter. The fight is silly, but the weapons are serious. Will deadly bombs be dropped? The story never tells. Some people felt the book was too scary for children. I've never read that book. But Ted knew kids could handle it. He felt his message about the madness of war was important. Ted was now world famous for some years. He had been sick with cancer, but there was one more book he needed to write. It was a book of advice about life's ups and downs called Oh, the Places You'll Go. Have you read that book? Yeah. We're going to read it again next week. So be sure when you step with care and great tact, and remember that life's a great balancing act. And will you succeed? Yes, you will indeed. 98.75% guaranteed. Kid, you'll move mountains. In a way, these were Ted's parting words. He died on September 24th, 1991. He left behind 44 books that have brought millions of children a great deal of joy. Every spring on Ted's birthday, people get together. They wear the striped cat hat, and they celebrate the words, the pictures, and the spirit of Dr. Seuss, the great doodler. So that's what we'll be celebrating next week. That was a long book, wasn't it?